In this section, we are going to learn all about the stomach. So when we look at the stomach, what we can see, it's kind of J-shaped. And there is a portion of the stomach which is actually superior to the level of the gastroesophageal sphincter. And that area of the stomach is known as the fundus. If we follow the esophagus down and we go along this border of the stomach and we kind of put a dotted line about there, this distal part of the stomach is known as the pylorus. And then this huge area between the pylorus and the fundus is known as the body of the stomach. When you open up the stomach, what you will notice is there are a lot of wrinkles. It's kind of like having a towel that's all smushed together. And the reason for this is if you consume, say, for instance, a Thanksgiving meal that's quite huge, then this mucosa can spread out without ripping intercellular connection. And so these infoldings are known as the rugae of the stomach. It's not the only organ with rugae. The stomach is completely innervated by the vagus nerve. And also don't forget that greater omentum we learned about previously. It is attached to what's known as the greater curvature of the stomach. So what the greater curvature is this area here, which is the larger surface of the stomach, the inferior portion of the stomach, as opposed to this portion here, which is known as the lesser curvature. Looking at the wall of the stomach, there are 3 layers of smooth muscle here. So that's the difference. We still have an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer, but now, and so we have like the X and Y axis taken care of, but now we have a 3rd layer going at the Z axis, which is oblique, and this is the innermost layer. So the innermost oblique layer, and that's how you get 3 layers of smooth muscle. So that tells you that there's going to be a lot of motor activity going on in the stomach, doing that process of alternating, contracting, and relaxing. And do you remember the term for that? That's right, peristalsis. There's a lot of peristalsis in the stomach. At the distal part of the stomach, there is a thickening of the circular layer forming what is known as the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is very prominent. You can feel it from the outside of the stomach, and it has the size of a small plum. And this totally controls the emptying of the stomach contents into the small intestine. If we look at a meal, in the first half hour after you have eaten a meal, almost nothing leaves the stomach because it has not undergone enough mechanical and chemical digestion. And after that, then the pyloric sphincter lets about a teaspoon out at a time. So at approximately 2.5 to 3 hours after you have eaten a normal sized meal, the stomach should be pretty empty again. Now, on the other hand, if you're drinking your meals, like if you're on one of those diets where you drink some type of a smoothie instead of eating a meal, I want you to know that that liquid meal the majority of it will be out of your stomach in 30 minutes. So this is the reason why you're going to feel hungry long before your next meal time. So what's the function of the stomach? Well, temporarily at least, it stores food, typically anywhere between 1 liter and 1.5 liters of food at any one time. This is a beautiful picture of the stomach. In the upper right corner, you can see the white esophagus coming down. You can see the narrowing right here, which is the gastroesophageal sphincter. And at the distal end, I think you can clearly see this thickened band over here, which is where the pyloric sphincter is. And this has gorgeous rugae spread throughout it. In addition to storing food, as we alluded to, because of the muscle layers, we're going to have a lot of mechanical digestion. And we actually are going to have some chemical digestion that we are starting in the stomach, and that is protein digestion. We will see shortly how that happens. The net result of the stomach doing its job with all of its secretions is you get this slightly slimy pea soup material called chyme. And this is what's going to exit the stomach. Perhaps you have seen this if you've been ill at any time and vomited, you have this stuff that comes up. Okay, so in case you're feeling gross, this is just a picture of pea soup. Now, in reality, I should have found a picture of pea soup that had little bits of carrots and little bits of maybe ham and little bits of potatoes in it, because it's not going to be completely emulsified like in this picture. You're going to have tiny little chunks of stuff left behind. The stomach is important for digestion, but it doesn't do any absorption of nutrients. For that, the chyme has to move into the small intestine. However, that doesn't mean there's no absorption that happens in the stomach, because something that is absorbed and very easily absorbed is alcohol. So if you want to slow down your alcohol absorption, you have to put a barrier between the alcohol and the stomach lining, and that barrier is food. Okay, so don't do just shots. They will be absorbed very quickly, like within half an hour. If you're only doing alcohol, at least make it a mixed drink, so that tomato juice, you can at least pretend that you are eating something nutritional, realizing, of course, that will be absorbed pretty quickly too. So eat food when you are drinking alcohol to slow down its absorption. And don't forget that pyloric sphincter gives a very controlled, very slow emptying of the gastric contents. We certainly can eat the meal a lot faster than the stomach can get rid of the meal. If you look at the surface of the stomach, what you'll notice is there are these little indentations, each of which is called a gastric pit. So I'm going to look at the blow-up picture on the right. And if you go down a gastric pit, what you will notice further down is that there are gastric glands there. And so these are in the mucosa and maybe a little bit into the submucosa. Looking at these gastric pits and glands, you can see that they're cells of many varied colors because there are very specialized cells in the pits and the glands. So let's explore this and see what these cells are called and what they do. But before we get to there, I forgot. Look at this, where we have the tan and the pink color, and figure out what type of epithelium we have in the stomach. If you didn't already figure it out a long time ago on that esophagus to stomach junction where it was a photomicrograph, well, here is your drawing. So perhaps it's easier for you to figure out from here. And what I want to point out in this simple epithelium, there are a lot of tight junctions. So refresh your memory. Tight junctions mean we have rows of transmembrane proteins. Those two cells are stuck together and nothing can go between the cells. So whatever gastric juices, whatever's in the stomach cannot travel between the cells. It's going to have to go into the cells. All right, let's talk about what those gastric secretions are. So let's blow up one of these pits and let's talk about different cell types. So those whitish and those light pink cells, they are both mucus cells. So the whitish ones are the ones on the surface, and then the pink ones, those are the ones down in the gastric, the neck of the gland. And they both secrete mucus that is alkaline. In other words, it has a high pH. And there's so much mucus secreted that it actually forms a barrier on the surface of the stomach that's about 1.5 millimeters thick. You actually can peel this layer off. It is so thick. So the whole point of that mucus is it's covering the epithelium, so whatever is going to be on its surface cannot affect the epithelium. Looking further down in the glands, you can see on this picture, we've got at the base, we've got some dark blue triangular cells. We've got lots of purple cells, and then we have this pale blue, kind of like Miss Pac-Man eater kind of cells. And let's start with those first. Those are called parietal cells. And parietal cells, their biggest thing is to secrete hydrochloric acid. And what this does is it makes the pH 2. Okay, remember pHs run from 1 to 14. So this is super acidic. So if we didn't have all the mucus from the alkaline mucus, this pH basically would burn its way through these cells and you would end up with gastric ulcers. So that is good that we have all that mucus. See, but why do we have this hydrochloric acid? Well, a couple of different reasons. There's going to be a real important reason I'm going to show you in a moment, but right now, imagine if you ate something that had any bacteria on the surface, the hydrochloric acid could kill those bacteria. But something else this hydrochloric acid does is, you know, all the amylase your salivary glands was producing to start the carbohydrate digestion? Well, as soon as that amylase hits the hydrochloric acid, it is broken up. So that was very short-lived carbohydrate digestion. Do you think you got all your carbs digested in the amount of time it took you to chew and the 10 seconds it took to hit your gastric contents? Yeah, no, you didn't. Which means we're going to have to do more carbohydrate digestion later on. We're just not going to do it in the stomach. So moving on to those purple cells are called chief cells, and they secrete a substance called pepsinogen. So anytime you have a molecule that ends with gen, that's just telling you it's a bigger molecule and it's going to be activated when a piece of it is cut off, because gen is for genesis, as in creating something. And so when that piece is cut off, then you have the active molecule. And so the active molecule for pepsinogen is something called pepsin. So how do we cut off part of pepsinogen to make pepsin? Well, our friend hydrochloric acid is what does this reaction. Okay, and so now it's great. Now we've got lots of pepsin floating around in the stomach and go, well, I wish I knew what pepsin does, and I'll tell you what it does. This starts protein digestion here in the stomach. All right, moving on. A concept that not only is going to be in the stomach, but it's also going to be in other places in the intestine are what we call enteroendocrine cells. So entero meaning intestinal and endocrine cells. So here we have single cells which have an endocrine function. And in this case, these are unicellular paracrine glands. In other words, they're not going to act on themselves, but they're going to act on the nearby cells. So in the stomach, these dark blue triangular cells, these are the enteroendocrine cells. And in the stomach, we're at the other intestine, they all have specific names, but we're not going to bother learning their specific names. We're just going to call them all enteroendocrine cells. The ones located in the stomach secrete a substance called gastrin. So what makes you secrete gastrin? When you ingest dietary protein. So when dietary protein comes in, your body secretes gastrin. What does gastrin do? Well, gastrin makes our friend the chief cell secrete pepsinogen, and it also makes our parietal cells secrete the hydrochloric acid, which then can act on the pepsinogen to form pepsin, which then can digest the protein that started this whole process. And isn't this a beautiful little concept map loop? Sorry. Yeah, it really is. All right, almost done. Going back to those parietal cells for a minute, because they do a couple of other things, one of which is super important. One thing that the parietal cell does, which is interesting but really isn't important for our studying, but it is if you go on to further studies, is it secretes something called ghrelin, which actually as soon as this happens, that will stimulate your appetite, which is why you may eat a few bites saying, I'm not hungry, and as soon as you start eating, you realize, oh, I guess I was really hungry. But the more important thing that this is going to secrete that I want to talk about is something called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is a molecule that's going to bind to one of our dietary vitamins, vitamin B12. So let me show you how that works and what its importance is. Okay. So when you eat something like meat, which contains vitamin B12, the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin basically are going to start digesting that meat, which releases the vitamin B12. And then the parietal cells, with its intrinsic factor being secreted, both the B12 and the intrinsic factor are going to leave the stomach through the pyloric sphincter. And then once they're in that first part of the small intestine, those two chemicals are going to bind to each other. And what the intrinsic factor allows is that the vitamin B12 can travel the entire length of the small intestine without being chemically digested. And so the intrinsic factor is bound to it. It goes all the way to the distal part, the terminal part of the small intestine, where this complex of intrinsic factor and B12 gets absorbed into your bloodstream and then gets broken apart, and B12 then gets to do its job, which has to do with hemoglobin synthesis, has a lot to do with DNA integrity, giving you normal neural function, and some folate metabolism. So it prevents some anemias as well as other important things. So without the intrinsic factor, then vitamin B12 would be destroyed. So if you're vitamin B12 deficient, you cannot take B12 pills because they will be destroyed as they travel through your small intestine, which is why you would have to have either injections or you'd have to have something that you would put under the tongue where it could be absorbed into the bloodstream from your oral cavity. Because if it goes into your intestines, we've got enzymes that are going to break it down before it can be absorbed. So at this point, I want you to do, I've written out and put little circles here for you to fill out what happens in the stomach, put cells as well as chemicals they produce when dietary protein enters the stomach. And so just to show you that you can make these concept maps, and for the digestive system, you really need to be making concept maps so that you understand what's happening. All right, and I want to thank you. And with this, we are done with our exploration of the stomach. I will see you shortly as we continue in the small intestine.